I pretended to be broke during my divorce while hiding millions in offshore accounts. The paperwork felt heavier than it should have as I signed my name on the divorce settlement documents, knowing full well that my wife had no idea about the $23 million sitting in 3 different banks across the Cayman Islands. She thought we were splitting our modest savings of $40,000 and the house we'd bought together 15 years ago when we were still young and stupid enough to believe love conquers all financial hardship. My hands trembled slightly as I watched her calculate her half of what she believed was our entire net worth, her face showing that familiar mix of disappointment and resignation that had become so common in our conversations over the past 2 years. She had always been the practical one, the one who clipped coupons and turned off lights in empty rooms, while I supposedly struggled to keep my small consulting business afloat during the economic downturn that had affected so many people in our neighborhood. The truth was far more complicated than she could have imagined, and it started 3 years earlier when I accidentally discovered a massive data breach at one of the companies I was legitimately consulting for. Instead of reporting it immediately like any decent person would have done, I spent weeks studying the vulnerability, learning how their financial systems worked, and gradually realizing that I could exploit this weakness without anyone ever tracing it back to me. My wife often complained about our tight budget during those early months when I was secretly siphoning money from multiple corporate accounts, always taking small amounts that would look like routine processing errors or minor accounting discrepancies. She would stress about our mortgage payments while I sat in my home office, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars through a complex network of shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges that I had spent months researching and setting up. The irony wasn't lost on me that she had suggested marriage counseling around the same time I was making my largest transfers, worried that our financial stress was driving us apart when I was actually becoming wealthier than either of us had ever dreamed possible. I would nod sympathetically as she talked about maybe getting a second job or selling her grandmother's jewelry, all while knowing that I could have paid off our house with the money I had made in just the previous week. Living a double life became exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated, especially when she started taking on extra work to help with our supposed money problems. I would watch her come home exhausted from her regular job and then immediately sit down at the kitchen table to work on freelance projects late into the night, her laptop screen casting a blue glow across her tired face as she typed away at articles and reports that paid embarrassingly little for the amount of effort she put in. The guilt was manageable at first because I told myself that I was protecting her from the stress of knowing about the illegal source of our newfound wealth. But as months passed, and I continued to let her believe we were struggling financially, something fundamental began to shift in how I viewed our relationship. I started to resent her constant worrying about money, her careful budgeting, and her suggestions that we cut back on small luxuries that meant nothing to me anymore. She began to change too, becoming more distant and critical, especially when she thought I wasn't pulling my weight financially or emotionally. Our conversations became increasingly tense, with her pointing out that other couples our age seemed to be doing better than us, that her friends were taking vacations and buying new cars while we were still driving the same beat-up sedan we'd owned for 8 years. The breaking point came during a particularly heated argument about whether we could afford to fix our leaking roof or if we should just put buckets out during rainstorms and hope for the best. She was practically in tears talking about how embarrassing it was to have her sister offer to lend us money, while I sat there knowing that I could have bought our entire neighborhood without making a significant dent in my hidden fortune. That night, as she slept beside me, I realized that I had created a situation where the success of my deception had become the failure of my marriage. I had convinced her so thoroughly that we were financially unstable that she had begun to lose respect for me as a provider and partner, while I had grown to see her as someone who couldn't handle the truth about what I had done to secure our future. The divorce proceedings began 6 months later, initiated by her after she said she couldn't continue living with the constant stress of our financial insecurity and my apparent inability to improve our situation. I played the role of the defeated husband perfectly, agreeing to her terms and even expressing gratitude that she was being so reasonable about the division of our limited assets. My lawyer, who had no idea about my offshore accounts, actually seemed impressed by how amicably we were handling everything, commenting that most couples with financial problems ended up in much messier situations. I nodded and played along, secretly relieved that the legal fees for both sides would barely register as a rounding error in my hidden wealth. The most challenging part wasn't the legal proceedings or the paperwork, but maintaining the facade during our final months living in the same house while everything was being finalized. She would sometimes break down crying about how scared she was to start over financially at her age, worried about whether she would be able to afford her own place and still help support her aging parents who had their own monetary struggles. I found myself in the bizarre position of comforting her about financial fears that I could have eliminated with a single phone call, but doing so would have meant explaining 3 years of lies and criminal activity that would have destroyed not just our marriage, but potentially my freedom as well. The weight of that secret became heavier each day, especially when I saw how much genuine anxiety she was experiencing about her future. During one of our last conversations as a married couple, she thanked me for being understanding about the divorce and apologized for not being able to make things work despite our financial challenges. She said she hoped that someday we would both find a way to be more financially stable and maybe even happy, completely unaware that I was already both of those things and had been for years. The day she moved out was surprisingly emotional, even though our relationship had been deteriorating for months. As I helped her load her belongings into the rental truck, I kept thinking about how different things might have been if I had made different choices 3 years earlier, either by reporting the data breach like I should have, or by finding a way to gradually introduce legitimate wealth into our lives. But the strangest part came 2 weeks after she had settled into her new apartment, when I received a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about our marriage and my carefully constructed deception. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, claiming to represent a federal task force investigating financial crimes, and they wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my consulting work with several companies over the past 3 years. My blood ran cold as I realized that someone had finally connected the dots between my legitimate consulting contracts and the money that had been disappearing from corporate accounts during the same time periods. The caller was professional but firm, making it clear that this wasn't a request but rather a courtesy notification that I was officially under investigation. As I hung up the phone, I sat in my empty house, surrounded by furniture that my ex-wife had decided to leave behind, contemplating how quickly my perfect crime had unraveled and wondering if she would ever find out that our financial problems had been completely fabricated. The money was still sitting in those offshore accounts, but now it felt more like evidence than wealth, and I began to understand that I might need it more for legal defense than for the comfortable retirement I had been planning. The investigation moved faster than I had expected, with federal agents showing up at my door within a week to execute a search warrant and seize my computers, phones, and financial records. They were thorough and professional, but I could tell from their questions that they already had a substantial amount of evidence linking me to the missing funds. What I hadn't anticipated was that my ex-wife would be contacted as part of their investigation, since we had been married during the period when the crimes were committed. She called me that evening, confused and frightened, asking if I knew why federal agents were asking her questions about our finances and whether I had been involved in anything illegal. I could hear the fear in her voice as she described how the agents had asked her detailed questions about our lifestyle, our spending habits, and whether she had ever suspected that I might have access to money that I hadn't disclosed to her. She told them honestly that we had struggled financially throughout our marriage and that she had often worried about how we would pay our bills each month. The irony was overwhelming as I realized that her genuine testimony about our supposed financial struggles was actually providing me with an alibi of sorts, since it supported the image I had cultivated of being barely able to make ends meet. The agents seemed surprised by her responses, apparently expecting that a spouse would have noticed some evidence of the substantial wealth I had been accumulating. But then came the first major surprise that I hadn't seen coming, when she mentioned during that phone call that she had been contacted by her divorce attorney about some irregularities in the financial disclosure documents I had submitted during our proceedings. Apparently, the federal investigation had triggered some kind of automatic review of recent legal filings, and there were questions about whether I had been completely truthful about my assets. The second surprise came when she told me that she had been thinking about our marriage differently since the agents had visited her, reconsidering some of the financial decisions I had made and some of the explanations I had given for our money problems. She was starting to piece together a pattern that she hadn't noticed before, small inconsistencies in my stories about client payments and business expenses that now seemed suspicious in light of the federal investigation. I tried to maintain my innocence during that conversation, but I could tell that she was no longer the trusting wife who had believed everything I told her about our financial situation. The federal investigation had inadvertently opened her eyes to the possibility that I had been deceiving her, even if she didn't yet understand the full extent of what I had done. The third and most devastating surprise came a week later, when I received a call from my attorney informing me that my ex-wife had filed a motion to reopen our divorce settlement based on allegations of financial fraud and hidden assets. She was claiming that I had deliberately concealed substantial wealth during our marriage and divorce proceedings, and she was demanding a complete forensic audit of all my financial activities. The federal investigation had given her the leverage she needed to challenge our divorce agreement, and now I was facing the possibility of both criminal charges and having to give up half of the money I had stolen to the woman I had spent years lying to about our financial situation. The elegant simplicity of my original plan was collapsing into a nightmare of legal complications that threatened to destroy everything I had worked to build. As I sat in my lawyer's office discussing strategy for both the criminal and civil cases, I couldn't help but think about how different my life might have been if I had simply been honest with my wife from the beginning. The money that had seemed like such a solution to all our problems had instead become the source of even bigger problems that I wasn't sure I could solve. The worst part was knowing that she was probably going through her own emotional turmoil, realizing that the man she had been married to for 15 years was essentially a stranger who had been living a completely fabricated life. The financial stress that had driven her to divorce me hadn't been real, but the betrayal she was experiencing now was deeper and more painful than anything we had gone through during our marriage. But the final surprise that changed everything came when I discovered that the federal investigation wasn't actually focused on me at all, but rather on one of my former clients who had been using my consulting services as a cover for their own much larger financial crimes. The agents had been investigating them for months and had only contacted me because they thought I might have unknowingly helped facilitate their schemes. The realization that I had been panicking about the wrong crime was both relieving and terrifying, because it meant that my actual criminal activities were still undiscovered by law enforcement, but my ex-wife's investigation into our divorce settlement was proceeding regardless of what the federal agents were actually looking for. I had created a situation where the cover-up was becoming worse than the original crime. My attorney explained that even if the federal investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing related to my client's activities, the civil case with my ex-wife would still move forward based on her allegations of hidden assets and financial deception during our marriage. The legal system would treat those as separate issues, and I would need to defend myself on both fronts while trying to keep my actual crimes from being discovered. The strategy we developed was risky, but seemed like the only viable option, which was to gradually reveal some of the offshore accounts, while claiming that I had been legitimately consulting for international clients and had been keeping the money hidden to avoid complicated tax issues. It wasn't entirely truthful, but it was closer to the truth than anything I had told my wife during our marriage. The process of unwinding 3 years of financial deception was more complicated than I had anticipated, requiring teams of accountants and lawyers to trace money through multiple jurisdictions and corporate structures. Every document they reviewed and every transaction they analyzed brought me closer to having to explain how I had actually acquired the wealth I was now being forced to disclose. My ex-wife's reaction when she learned about the first offshore account was exactly what I had expected, a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief that I had let her struggle with financial worries while sitting on millions of dollars. She demanded to know why I had lied to her, why I had let our marriage fall apart over money problems that didn't actually exist, and whether anything about our relationship had been genuine. I tried to explain that I had been trying to protect her from the complications of having wealth that came from questionable sources, but she correctly pointed out that I had never given her the chance to make that choice for herself. Instead, I had made the decision unilaterally to deceive her about something that affected every aspect of our daily lives together. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, with forensic accountants discovering more and more evidence of my hidden wealth, while I struggled to provide explanations that were technically true but didn't reveal the full extent of my criminal activities. Each new discovery made me look more deceptive and calculating, even though I was actually trying to minimize the damage to both of us. The final settlement was larger than our original divorce agreement, but smaller than what my ex-wife could have claimed if she had known about all the money from the beginning. She received enough to be financially secure for the rest of her life, which was something I found myself genuinely happy about despite everything that had happened between us. The day we signed the final paperwork, she told me that she didn't hate me, but that she would never understand why I had chosen to lie to her about something so fundamental to our life together. She said that if I had been honest from the beginning, she might have been able to help me figure out a better way to handle whatever situation had led to my having hidden money. Looking back now, I realize that she was probably right, that my decision to deceive her had created far more problems than it solved, and had ultimately destroyed the most important relationship in my life. The money that I had thought would give us security and freedom had instead become a barrier between us that I had built higher and stronger with each lie I told. The federal investigation eventually concluded without any charges being filed against me, since they determined that I had been an unwitting participant in my client's schemes rather than a co-conspirator. But the damage to my personal life was already done, and I was left with more money than I knew what to do with and nobody to share it with. I still have most of the offshore accounts, though they feel more like reminders of my mistakes than assets I can enjoy. Sometimes I think about donating large portions of it to charity, but I worry that doing so might draw attention to how I acquired it in the first place. My ex-wife and I don't speak anymore, though I hear through mutual friends that she's doing well and has started dating someone new. I'm genuinely happy for her, even though I know that our story probably serves as a cautionary tale she shares about the importance of honesty in relationships. The house feels too big now, filled with furniture and memories from a life that was built on deception. I've thought about selling it and moving somewhere new, but I'm not sure that changing my location would change the fundamental problems with how I've chosen to live my life. The consulting business that provided cover for my criminal activities continues to operate legitimately, though I'm much more careful about the clients I work with and the projects I take on. The legitimate income is more than enough to live comfortably, which makes the stolen money feel even more unnecessary and burdensome. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, wondering if today will be the day that someone finally connects all the dots and realizes what I actually did to acquire my wealth. The statute of limitations hasn't expired, and I know that if the right investigator looked at the right records, they could probably build a case against me. But mostly I think about the conversation I never had with my wife, the one where I explained what I had done and asked for her help in figuring out how to make things right. Maybe she would have been horrified and left me anyway, but at least she would have had the chance to make that decision with complete information about who I really was. The money sits in those accounts, earning interest and growing larger each year, but it feels more like a prison sentence than a fortune. I can't spend it without risking exposure, I can't enjoy it without feeling guilty, and I can't get rid of it without potentially incriminating myself. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just reported that data breach when I first discovered it, lived with whatever financial struggles we were actually facing, and trusted that my wife and I could have worked through our problems together. The money I stole was supposed to solve our problems, but instead it became the biggest problem of all. The divorce is final now, the investigation is closed, and I'm left with exactly what I thought I wanted 3 years ago, more money than I need and complete control over my financial future. But I've learned that having everything you think you want isn't the same as being happy, especially when you've lost the people who mattered most while trying to get it.